There is a growing group of people who are becoming concerned that in this year of 2024, there is going to be another video game industry crash. In 2023, we saw over 10,000 developers laid off, but just a couple months into 2024, we've already seen over 8,000 developers laid off. And so with so much left in the year, many are thinking that there's going to be a significantly higher amount of developers being laid off this year. And then you look at Nintendo, who reportedly has internally delayed their console, their next-gen console, what we've been calling the Switch 2, from a late 2024 release to the first quarter of 2025 at the earliest. And many are wondering why. Some have debated that it might have something to do with the low value of the yen right now. And over the last few years, Nintendo's been seeing a bit of a steady drop in their sales. So when you factor all of this together, it begs the question, does a second game industry crash concern Nintendo? And that's what I would like to talk about today. Welcome everyone, this is AndresRestart, and yes, today we're going to be talking about if a second video game crash is something that Nintendo should be worried about. But before going forward, let me point out that we are aiming for a goal of 40,000 subscribers, so if you do enjoy my content, please subscribe and hit that notification bell. To get things started here, I think we should first establish what would be a game industry crash. Because when people are talking about there being a second video game industry crash, it implies that we're going to see something similar to what happened back in 1983. So back in 1983, a large-scale recession started that took place primarily in the United States. Video game revenue was peaking at around $3.2 billion and then fell to around $100 million by 1985. This was almost a 97% drop. That is a staggering drop, as I'm sure many of you can tell. And there are many reasons attributed to this drop. One part having to do with oversaturation. There were dozens of different video game companies back then, including Atari. Nowadays, we just talk about Nintendo, Xbox, and PlayStation, but it wasn't like that then. You would go to a toy store, not an electronics store, but a toy store in the toy aisle, and you might see 10 different video game systems from 10 different companies. And there were also so many different types of games, but there wasn't really a great measure of quality, so many people were making purchases and oftentimes not finding good quality there. So there was a broken trust with the consumer, there was a confusion, there was the rise of the PC market, and the game industry at the time was still very young and so was far more volatile and subject to a crash or a large-scale recession. And so that's what happened. The game industry revenue had a nosedive. So with all that in mind, when I hear these conversations about us seeing a new video game crash in 2024, that would imply that we're going to see a mass drop in revenue in the industry. And when I say a mass drop, I'm not talking about 5, 10, 15%, because the video game crash of 1983 was a 97% drop. That's almost not even existing anymore. And where the industry is at currently in terms of revenue, yes, they had a peak in 2021, which you could likely attribute to the pandemic because many people were buying games while they were quarantining. But 2023 saw a little bit of a pickup over the prior year in 2022. Point being, we're not really seeing any signs that there's going to be a mass drop-off in terms of revenue. The prior year, things picked up a little bit. And maybe 2024 does see a drop-off. But most analysts currently expect the game industry to continue to rise over the years, not diminish by any significant margin in the foreseeable future. So then, if there isn't any actual evidence or expectation of a crash in revenue, then why is there this discussion of a video game crash happening in 2024? Well, this conversation is happening in large part because of all the layoffs. As I mentioned in the introduction to this video, we are seeing a large amount of layoffs right now. Even some of the bigger companies are having significant layoffs. Recently, we learned that PlayStation laid off about 900 employees, and Microsoft, a huge company that recently had the Activision Blizzard acquisitions, laid off about 1,900 employees, including those from Xbox. So even the biggest names in the video game industry are having significant layoffs right now. And this is absolutely a concerning issue, and I do not want to downplay it in any way, shape, or form. It is unfortunate that you have these people who work so hard and are so dedicated, and they're losing their jobs. It is absolutely an indicator of an issue in the industry, but this is not an indicator of a game industry crash in the same way. Now, perhaps you can make an argument that if this continues, there's going to be some seismic shifts, maybe there will be protests, and there could be a mass amount of video game developers that may refuse to work in games until changes are made, similar to what we've seen in the film industry recently. And so if there aren't developers making games, then what happens? Well, we might see a slowing of game releases, which definitely would impact sales. But while it does seem unlikely that we could see a crash similar to 1983, there still may be some negative impacts moving forward. Let's look at a common example that people bring up with Spider-Man 2. Apparently this game cost over $300 million to make, and in order for them to break even, they would have had to have sold over 7.2 million copies. And it has, but at one point it was up for debate if it would. And there are many games that have extremely high budgets that don't get to that point where they break even or turn out to be quite profitable. And when looking at something like Spider-Man 2, which was a very highly praised game, a very well received game, one of the biggest releases of last year, to think that profitability was going to be a main concern like this, I think is exemplary of where the industry is at right now, where you have a lot of huge budget games that aren't necessarily going to sell well enough to succeed. And when you consider this on top of the fact that we are continually seeing advances in technology where the development costs for games continue to increase in an effort to push the envelope in terms of visual fidelity, effects, and performance, it's just getting harder and harder to be profitable while maintaining things on the cutting edge. And so there is an issue. But this brings us back to Nintendo. Should Nintendo be concerned about a video game crash or whatever it is the industry is currently suffering? Because as I talked about earlier, I don't think we're going to be seeing anything like 1983, but is there an issue going on with the industry? I think so. I think many will agree that there are issues that need to be addressed. And so with this in mind, can these issues impact Nintendo? Well, I mentioned specifically Sony and Microsoft having mass layoffs here because it's a little bit different for Nintendo. Apparently, Nintendo has one of the highest employee retention rates in Japan, 98.8% compared to the national average of 70%. They are retaining their employees, not laying them off en masse. So that is a stark contrast over the rest of the industry, including Sony and Microsoft. But as some of you may be thinking, well, that's likely having to do with how different Nintendo operates their business. They're not trying to make games on the absolute most cutting edge. Their hardware has always been about a generation behind, if not more sometimes. And while they do have some impressive games, there's also quite a balance. Not all of their games are massive budget efforts. They make choices that are efficient and smart, but still fun. And when they do have a big budget effort, say for example something like Tears of the Kingdom, they sell over 20 million and it does incredibly well. And while we don't know the exact budget behind Tears of the Kingdom or Breath of the Wild, we do know that both these games have exceeded the sales expectations of Nintendo. In other words, they're quite pleased and definitely have been profitable. So Nintendo is not in the same position as the rest of the industry. They are marching to the beat of their own drum, they're handling things in their own way, and they've been largely successful. Yes, I mentioned in the beginning of the video that Nintendo has had some declining sales over the last few years, but it's been nothing super significant. The sales are still largely healthy. Considering how late we are into the Switch generation, it's been out for over 7 years, this is pretty natural for there to be somewhat of a decline here. Nintendo's still seeing incredible success, especially from their software sales like Tears of the Kingdom, like Mario Wonder, but Nintendo's also branching off and seeing tremendous success in other ways, like with the release of the Mario Bros. Movie, which is said to be the second most successful animated movie of all time. That says a lot. So Nintendo is doing extremely well, even in these trying times, and while many may be frustrated and are concerned that Nintendo has delayed their console supposedly to next year, they're still in much better shape than the rest of the industry right now. And what I find even more interesting about this discussion is that many would say that one of the main reasons why the game industry climbed out of the crash of 1983 was because of the success of Nintendo with the Nintendo Entertainment System when it launched in 1985, and they quickly became the dominant market leaders when we started to see the industry come out of its big recession from that crash. Does a second game industry crash concern Nintendo? In one sense, no, not at all, because there isn't really any reason to think that we're going to see a crash similar to 1983. And then in another sense, where we're still acknowledging that while it may not be a crash like 1983, there are still issues in the industry and we're not headed in the best direction, Nintendo still shouldn't be that concerned because they're clearly showing that they're operating in a different way from most of the industry and are seeing great success. But I'll introduce a third sense. While Nintendo themselves may be doing pretty well, there are still industry-wide issues that will impact Nintendo. Nintendo works with their partners, and if their partners are having to make layoffs, that will impact them. And so, to some extent, I think Nintendo should be concerned, because the health of the industry is important for all parties involved, including Nintendo. But by Nintendo having success with the Switch, where developers can afford to make games with a lower development cost and see great success, and then hopefully what they're going to do with Switch 2, I think that will benefit the industry. And maybe some other companies could look at how Nintendo has operated and perhaps adjust things somewhat so we don't run into these same issues. But what do you all think? Let me know in the comments below. This is AndresRestart. Thank you so much for listening and watching, and I'll see you all really soon. Take care. Bye.